All right, everybody, welcome back. We've got one more day of me being absent, hopefully with COVID. So today we're going to do something similar to what we did last time. Have a couple short videos that you will have, and I will probably insert a question or two at the end of each of them for this time. So the first video we've got for today is the Bleeding Kansas period. And essentially what we're going to talk about, we ended last time talking about California entering the Union. And what we ended last time was in 1850 when California becomes the newest state in the Union and the Compromise of 1850. Remember, before that, there had been 15 free states and 15 slave states. And when California comes in, that tips the balance in favor of now those free states. And so they had this compromise that went in place. Part of that compromise was that they allowed for popular sovereignty in these new territories of Utah and New Mexico. Remember, they did a little bit as far as banning the slave trade in Washington, D.C., enforcing a Fugitive Slave Act, a few things like that. But this kind of helped keep the peace for a few years. The problem is that peace does not last for very long. And that peace begins to break down as these areas here, these what are currently in 1850, these unorganized territories, start to want to have enough people to populate them and begin to want to take part on the road towards statehood. You know, there are certain requirements. You have to become a territory, establish a government, have enough people, do a couple of other things, and eventually you can become a state. And as these areas in the middle part of the country start to get populated enough, they want to become states as well. And that is what kind of sets the United States on the path towards civil war. This all begins in 1854 with a gentleman by the name of Stephen A. Douglas. This fine, well-coiffed gentleman with a very high collar right here. He is a senator from the state of Illinois and is one of the new leaders in the Senate at the time and has some pretty big aspirations. In particular, he has his eyes eventually on becoming president of the United States. And so what he's doing is he's looking for legacy. He wants to do something big that can make his name across the country to allow him to kind of catapult himself to potentially run for president. And he sets his mind on this idea of being the senator that allows for the introduction of a transcontinental railroad, right? He wants to eventually build a railroad all the way across the United States, both because he wants, to try and create a sort of national profile, but also the big city in the West at this point in time is right here in Chicago. And so any major transcontinental railroad is likely to run through, no matter where it goes, north, south, or middle, is likely to run through his home state of Illinois. So Stephen A. Douglas would get double benefit from this, both helping out his home state, but also potentially running for president. So he's in favor of this railroad. However, if a railroad is going to go to the West Coast, it's going to have to cross through these unorganized territories. If it is going to go through Illinois, it's going to have to go through some of these unorganized territories to finally get to the West Coast. And the problem is that without having an organized government in those territories, that leaves the railroad open to all kinds of problems. You want to have a state government that it goes through so they can help protect the interest of that railroad. There's no reason to put a railroad through country where there's no government at all there to protect it. And so his whole point is he wants to try and allow for these new territories right here to enter the Union fairly quickly, or at least to organize as territories so that they can have governments so he can eventually put his railroad from Chicago out to the West Coast through. And so what he does is the big question though here is if you're going to introduce these new territories, that same old question of free state versus slave state balance comes into play. You know, we dealt with it briefly in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850 when California comes in. But if these new areas, what are now Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, if they start entering the Union, that's going to cause some problems. Because almost all of them are above that Missouri Compromise line, right? Now, almost wherever it is you're going to put a railroad from Chicago through is going to be above this old Missouri Compromise line. And that means these new states, states that eventually become Kansas, where I'm from, become Nebraska, become Colorado and Wyoming and South Dakota and North Dakota, all of them are above this Missouri Compromise line, which means every single one of those under the Missouri Compromise, and Montana as well, right? Every single one of those would become a free state. And so at the moment, we're at what? 16 versus 15. But if we add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, a little bit of math tells us that now becomes 23 versus 15. And that really upsets that balance of North versus South, slave state versus non-slave state, right? And so Stephen A. Douglas is like, well, I want to get this railroad done, but I need to find a way to not make everybody mad, to keep that balance in Congress. Because, again, he's trying to run for president. He doesn't want to upset everybody in the South because he needs those votes. And so what he does is he proposes what is called the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. And what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it does two things. First is pretty obvious. It sets aside two territories. The Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory. And puts both of those territories on the path to statehood, right? Because these are the two most likely places that a railroad might run through. That is thing one. Thing two, however, is in order to not upset the South, he tacks on to, in addition to creating these territories, he tacks on the idea that we should allow popular sovereignty in both of those territories. Remember, popular sovereignty is that idea that a state or a territory should be allowed to vote for itself, whether or not it wants to permit the practice of slavery or not, and not to have whether or not it can have slavery or not be dictated by Washington, D.C. So Stephen A. Douglas's whole approach is like, we'll just let the people of Kansas and Nebraska decide for themselves. He's like, hey, that way I don't have to take a stand on it. If they want to be a slave state, that's fine. They want to be a free state, that's fine. I don't make anybody angry. Both the South and the North will like me, and I'll get my railroad. Win for everybody. That's at least his thought. The problem is that does not work at all. Stephen A. Douglas thinks no one is going to be mad. Instead, everyone is mad. What this basically does is this pretty much breaks the country. It's weird. I grew up in Kansas. I don't know why people would get all upset about Kansas, but people did. And people got really, really, really mad. What it ended up doing is it literally broke the entire political system. The Democrats, the two major parties at the time, were the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. The Democrats, basically it broke the Democratic Party in half. The Northern Democrats at the time were absolutely furious about it because they were anti-slavery. And so it pretty much, any of the Democrats in the northern states were just livid at Stephen A. Douglas, hated this Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Democrats in the South were okay with it because it permitted that practice of slavery to potentially be extended further out into the new territories and allowed their economic model to continue. And so the Democratic Party literally in 1854 and in the election of 1856 just breaks in half. And it never really recovers. The other major party at the time was the Whig Party. Great name. Had been around for about 40 or 50 years, since about like 1820-ish. And this was kind of what you might think of as some of like your like economic Republicans today, kind of your wealthier merchant class kind of people, but they also strangely wanted a really strong central government. So it's kind of an interesting party comparison to what we have now. But this is kind of like your moneyed elites here versus the Democrats were kind of more like the party of the people. It was kind of the working class farmer, sort of Thomas Jefferson's kind of party, but they were clearly divided on this north-south axis based upon the issue of slavery. The Democrats pretty much break in half, and the Whig Party can't figure out what the heck to do with this. They don't know if they want to support a Kansas-Nebraska Act or if they want to go against it, and they're kind of like, oh, we don't know. And so in response to all of this, there is a new party that is formed for the first time in 1854 because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that is a party that is known as the Republican Party. It is the still same, it traces its lineage. It is the beginning of the modern Republican Party that we still see today. And it is formed by those northern anti-slavery Democrats who left the Democratic Party and the part of the Whig Party that were abolitionists, that didn't want slavery. It basically formed purely as an anti-slavery party in response to this Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the first thing this does is it fundamentally breaks American politics. It has previously there had been a nice, for about 50 years, a nice, stable two-party system, Whigs and Democrats. By about 1856, that next presidential election, and especially in 1860, you end up having four parties. You have a Northern Democratic Party, a Southern Democratic Party, a Whig Party, and a Republican Party, all fighting against each other. And so it's really makes this major change to American politics. That's the first thing that it does. So at this point, this is what the map looks like as of 1854 after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You have the new Kansas territory here, and you have everything else as the Nebraska territory, which eventually becomes like 5 other different states. And each of them are allowed popular sovereignty. And that popular sovereignty ends up causing major problems. Not only did it break politics, but it also actively caused conflict. And this is what is known as Bleeding Kansas. Again, popular sovereignty is that idea that the state or the territory gets to vote on whether or not they want to allow for slavery, right? At the time, Missouri, right next door to Kansas, is a slave state. It allows for the practice of slavery. Okay? This is very, very important. Because basically what happens is the people in Missouri, what they end up doing is, we're going to go back. They end up being like, well, no one has a real list of who's actually eligible to vote here in Kansas. So if I just show up at the polls, even if I'm from Missouri, I just hop on my horse right across here, go to someplace, 10 miles into the state and vote there. I can vote for the practice of slavery even though I don't live there. And that is exactly what happens. Basically, these pro-slavery Missourians, they just pour over the state line in droves in multiple elections trying to vote against the anti-slavery constitutions that are put forth. Most of the settlers in Kansas are against the practice of slavery. Actually, the term Jayhawk, the University of Kansas mascot are the Kansas Jayhawks. They're also my favorite basketball team, Rock Chalk. The term Jayhawker is a term for an anti-slavery Kansan. That was the nickname they gave themselves. And that is where even today the mascot of the Kansas Jayhawks comes from, that idea that the population of Kansas in territorial times primarily did not want the practice of slavery. They were an abolitionist free state group that wanted to create a non-slave state. But you had all these Missourians who were coming across the border to try and vote against those anti-slavery constitutions, to vote them down, to try and instead pass a pro-slavery constitution. And what ends up happening in Kansas, there are 2 constitutions that are put forward. There is a pro-slavery state legislature that shows up in a town called Lecompton, and they make a constitution that says Kansas should become a state and will allow the practice of slavery, right? And they submit that to the federal government for approval when Kansas becomes a state. At the same time, in the city of Topeka, which is actually where I used to live before moving out here, there is a different state legislature that forms, and they are an anti-slavery legislature, and they create their own constitution that prohibits, that disallows the practice of slavery, and wants to submit that to the federal government for approval. So basically, Washington, D.C., like Kansas, is applying to become a territory, to become a state. But it has two different groups who are both saying, we are the rightful representatives of this state. Here's the Constitution we have voted for. One is a slavery constitution, one is an abolitionist constitution. And the federal government is like, what do we do? President Pierce, he recognizes the pro-slavery one, very briefly. And that causes all kinds of problems. In response, you get this like backlash of anti-slavery folks in Kansas that they, very adamantly are like, no, those people in Lecompton are not us. That's the like Missouri folks coming over here. And the Missouri folks end up coming over even more. And there are several that eventually that Lecompton Constitution gets tossed out, and they decide, okay, fine, we're going to try this again. We will have another constitution put forward, and that one is a vote. There's a public vote of like whether or not it's going to be a pro-slave or anti-slave constitution. And what ends up happening over the next 2 years as this process is going on, you see what are called these border ruffians coming over from Missouri. It's not enough for them to just come over and vote. Now what they are doing is they're actually folks from Missouri crossing over into Kansas on multiple raids and attacking anti-slavery communities in the state of Kansas. Literally burning some of them to the ground, killing people who are anti-slavery because they want to try and basically drive fear into the hearts of the anti-slavery Kansans so that they will capitulate and be willing to put forth a pro-slavery constitution. In fact, in 1856, in May, the city of Lawrence, Kansas, again, where the Kansas Jayhawks are located, where the University of Kansas is literally, it is an abolitionist, anti-slavery stronghold. It's about 40 miles from the Missouri border. It is burned to the ground. Lawrence is right here. You have folks from like Clay County and Jackson County and Cass County all coming over here. And they actually end up coming to Lawrence, and they burn the city of Lawrence straight to the ground. You can still see there's all kinds of stuff going on there. You can still see a few buildings survived. You can still actually see the bullet holes in them. This is actually a hotel in downtown Lawrence. You can still see right here the bullet holes, the pockmarks from the bullet holes that are still in the facade of that building. It is one of the few buildings that survived the sacking of Lawrence. And this, 20-something people are killed in it there. And in response, a gentleman, I wouldn't say gentleman, he was kind of crazy. A guy by the name of John Brown, who was a religious zealot and very radical abolitionist, like so anti-slavery, willing to start wars about it. He gets a group of anti-slavery folks together and goes to Osawatomie, a town down here, which is a sort of like pro-slavery town. Pottawatomie Creek, my bad. That's this one here, Pottawatomie Creek, a pro-slavery settlement. And he gets a bunch of anti-slavery folks and goes in there and just finds finds like a farmer family and just, drags them out of their bed and like hatchets them to death in the middle of the night. As a response to this this pro-slavery burning of Lawrence. And so John Brown, this is depicted, this is actually a mural right here that is on the wall in the state of Kansas state legislature. Sort of depicts John Brown at the sort of the crossroads of the American Civil War kind of thing. He is probably the most extreme abolitionist in the country. After a couple of years, he eventually flees Kansas because he doesn't want to be caught for this, just out and out murder. He's trying to still raise like a slave revolt, trying to start a war because he believes so strongly against the cause of slavery that eventually he captures a federal armory in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., to try and get munitions, to try and get guns and ammunition for his proposed anti-slavery revolution. And he gets caught, and the federal government catches him and ends up prosecuting him for treason and hanging him. And his last words are essentially, I think if you watch the Crash Course video, it talks about him, but his last words are something along the lines of only through blood will we be able to, stop the scourge of slavery in this country, kind of thing. And then he basically becomes a martyr for the cause against slavery in this country. This is how sort of virulent it is. Over that span of about 2.5 years of violence, those are a couple of examples. Lawrence and Pottawatomie Creek, where John Brown does his thing. Over the span of about 2.5 years, more than 200 people are killed in Kansas based purely on this pro versus anti-slavery violence. And it is not simply limited to the state of Kansas. Actually, on literally the floor of the United States Senate, a representative from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, a very anti-slavery abolitionist senator from the state of Massachusetts, is giving a speech on the floor of the United States Senate talking about the horrors of slavery, and specifically talking about the state of South Carolina, which prohibits the practice of slavery at the time, and make some sort of pretty offensive comment, but it's like people from South Carolina are evil for doing this or something along those lines. And a representative from South Carolina named Preston Brooks hears about it, comes and listens, and takes offense to the comments. And what he does is, while Charles Sumner is literally on the floor of the United States Senate giving a speech, Preston Brooks walks up to him and beats him nearly to death with a metal-tipped cane, like a walking cane that has a big metal knob on the top where you would hold it on the hand. He uses that big brass-knobbed cane to beat Charles Sumner unconscious on the Senate floor while other senators are there watching, trying to pull him off, to keep him away from it. Charles Sumner does not immediately die from those wounds. He does recover, but he has a series of health problems for the next several years that are clearly a result of that, and about 5 or 6 years later eventually dies from those wounds. Literally, a member of the U.S. House, over a long period of time, beat a member of the United States Senate to death over the issue of slavery. And so this sort of violence that is going on in Kansas, where you've got 200 people dying, is not simply limited to a state or a new territory way out on the western part of the country. This type of violence is spreading all across the country, even to the floor of the United States Senate. And many people feel that this instance, even though the Civil War officially begins at the attack of Fort Sumter in April of 1860, many historians believe that it is this kind of violence right here that is in 1856, 4 years earlier, that is really the true sort of beginnings of the Civil War. Yep. And the last thing I'll say with this is, the reason why this is really relevant, I think, is you're beginning to see, in some instances, similar kind of violence today that you did at that time. There have been, a lot of political scientists have pointed out that America right now is is the most politically divided that it has been since the decade leading up to the Civil War, since the time when representatives were beating senators with a brass-tipped cane on the floor of the Senate. That we as a country are just as politically divided now as we were then, in terms of our identification with party and viewing the other party not as people but simply as evil. And that is true on both sides. That is not something that is unique to one party or another. Like that phenomena, social scientists, political scientists done a lot of research in it, to a point that I was doing a project in law school at one point and doing some research on this. And it turns out that in about the last 5 to 7 years, when you ask people what is like the quality that is most inherent in your personal identity, that is the most core of your person, of who you are, more people over the last 5 to 7 years have said either being Republican or Democrat. They identify their political affiliation as a more core, basic part of who they are than their religious belief system. Over the last decade, people have begun to think politics, their political identity, is more central to who they are than even their religious identity. That tells you just how big of a political divide there is. And we are seeing over the last 5 to 7 years, we are seeing a stark increase in political violence in this country. You know, a couple of years ago, somebody broke into Nancy Pelosi's house trying to find her, and when she couldn't find her, only found her husband, and then beat her husband with a hammer. There was a gentleman, a gentleman who was Brett Kavanaugh, who is a newer member of the United States Supreme Court, who is more conservative. There were some pro-choice protesters who literally who broke into Brett Kavanaugh's, or were arrested near Brett Kavanaugh's house with concrete plans to attempt to murder a Supreme Court justice because they disagreed with him politically. Obviously, we've got, the insurrection in January 6th of 2021. You also, I don't even think it's on here. This sort of begins as early as like 6 or 7 years ago with at the congressional baseball game at a practice. Members of Congress were practicing. They annually play a game of baseball against each other. That at a practice, somebody who was anti-government went there and with like an assault rifle and started shooting up the place. Ended up killing like 2 staffers and severely injuring several members of the United States House. Like this type of violence is going on right now in this country. And it is eerily similar to what you saw during Bleeding Kansas, where just political violence is beginning to become a thing much more in this country. And it is very, very eerie and very, very frightening of how violent we have become politically over the last few years because of this increasing divide. And there are lots of people beginning to ask a question of, is the United States headed towards a second civil war? I don't know if we are, but certainly there are some very eerie parallels that make people ask those questions and ask those questions with a great deal of seriousness. We're going to stop there. I've got a couple shorter videos. I know this was long, but I think there's a lot of important stuff. We'll have 2 videos. I think the next one will be on the Dred Scott decision.